Hello and welcome to the Approach Angle Podcast, a pitcherless podcast dedicated to teaching you all things baseball analytics. I'm your host, Nate Schwartz, joined as always by Director of Analytics, Kyle Bland. We're back from our brief summer break and back at it. So Kyle, how's it going?
Good. Still shaking the rust off from my break from not watching a ton of baseball. So got to get the old eye test recalibrated now that games are getting back in. But yeah, otherwise enjoyed a little respite from all of the new data coming in all the time.
Yeah, same here. Watched a lot of World Cup soccer. It's been really fun. And now that the All-Star break is ending, I'd like to say we were on an All-Star break, but we were most definitely not. In kind of a preview here, we did compete against the Palazzo Fantasy Baseball podcast in a fantasy baseball family feud style game. It was really fun, but all I'll say is we have some player development to do on our side. But today we're going to be talking about pitch tunneling and arsenals. So we go back a couple weeks. We spent the last couple episodes talking about pitches specifically, stuff models, movement, how good is a pitch in a vacuum on its own. Today, we're going to be looking at a little bit larger scale of how a pitch performs within that arsenal and how it interacts with one another. As we know, baseball has really transitioned into focusing on individual pitches of here's this wipeout slider that a guy's going to throw a ton. Here's a great fastball you're going to see over and over and over. But the historic basis of pitching is built on multiple pitches and feels, changing speeds, changing locations. And a 94 mile an hour fastball looks completely different when it comes after a curveball than thrown in an 0-0 count when you haven't seen anything else. The sequencing matters. How the movements play together is really important. As how the shapes play together is really important. So we're going to be doing this in 2.5 parts. We'll start with what tunneling actually is and get into why it's such an effective concept and how it binds a lot of pitches together. And then we'll transition into how arsenals as a whole actually are both built to optimize tunnels and overall interactions. And if we have time, we'll close by talking about some specific pitchers who are doing some interesting things with their tunnels. And really, before we get into this, I'm going to take a quick aside. You've heard about Jordan Walker on this podcast, maybe every episode of the 15. We are now here. He's the home run derby champion. It was awesome. And I really just wanted to take my platform to say how awesome it was, how cool of a moment. And for everyone who's been listening to day one before the season started, you guys all know that I have been really in and rooting for his success, despite maybe the flaws in his profile that I was maybe talking about in the beginning of the year. But it's been really cool. And I just had to briefly bring that up. But getting back into it, I'll start really basic here. Kyle, what is a pitch tunnel and what is it as a concept as a whole?
So pitch tunneling is a measurement for pitching, but that is actually about hitter perception. And the idea behind pitch tunneling is you want the pitch to you want your suite of pitches, whatever your mix is, how all of your pitch types, you want them to appear very similar as they approach the point where a hitter must decide how to make a swing, when and how to make a swing. And basically the idea there is that like hitters need time to actually swing the bat to get it from on their shoulder to where it's crossing the plane in a competitive swing, crossing the plate in a competitive swing. And so that takes time. And so the hitter needs to initiate that movement earlier in the pitch, like during ball flight. And so there is a decision point between where the pitcher is and where home plate is, where the hitter has seen all of that ball flight from that pitch type and needs to make a decision of, okay, I think it's this pitch, I think it's going here, so I'm going to swing at it and I'm going to swing here, or I'm not going to swing. And the idea with tunneling is you want to make your pitches all seem very similar until that decision point that you can't tell if it's a fastball or an off-speed pitch or a breaking pitch, so that you kind of are guessing a little bit. And then it's also very important that those pitches then have this idea of like late break, that they look similar until the batter has to make a decision, and then post when they make that decision, the pitches kind of just scatter in different directions. You can think of it kind of like a palm tree, where you want it to be like very like along the same track and then at the end branches out into a bunch of different directions all at once. That's the idea of like what great tunneling would look like. And the idea, even if the phrasing of tunneling hasn't been around forever, but like it tracks with kind of pitching theory. Greg Maddox, people talk about the downfall that everyone's chasing stuff. Maddox through gas. It's very important to qualify any discussion with that, but he's also great at pitchability. And he had two quotes that kind of track with this pitch tunneling concept that he said every pitch should look as close to every other as possible. And then he also commented that the bigger the break, the sooner the ball must start to swerve and the more time the hitter has to react. So basically, these bigger shapes, hitters can see them sooner, and so they have more time to react to it. And then he also said the later the break, the less reaction time. And so he understood that maybe there is a benefit to not having as big of shapes because they're not as obvious to the hitter. And so you get some value from uncertainty rather than like just pure nastiness. And so that was kind of Maddox's thoughts on tunneling.
And it's interesting to hear a quote from Maddox about that when he's kind of the first person that people go to of, oh, baseball isn't what it used to be. Let's all look at this historically great pitcher. Why can't everyone be like him? But when you hear a quote like that, it's interesting when you go back to our stuff model discussion. Why isn't it always more break, always good? Like there are aspects to these pitches that sometimes smaller profiles can be a lot more effective compared to what they're going against, what the sequencing is. But what is happening between the pitcher's hand, between that release point and the home plate that makes two pitches either tunnel well or not? I know it's going to be a lot of it depends, but what are the kind of key things you're looking at when it comes to trying to understand how these pitches might work together very well?
A lot of it, I mean, it's very stuff model coded because a lot of it has to do with release traits, velo, and movement. And basically, release is if you're releasing your pitches in a similar way. So, like the angle, like how they look coming out of your hand looks similar. That will be like a positive tunneling trait. And then, generally, if they have more movement, that will be a also a positive tunneling trait because they'll move distinctly from each other. But as we kind of, as Maddox mentioned, and as we're alluding to, that there may kind of be such a thing as too much break in regards to it's then inversely related to tunneling because it becomes obvious.
Yeah, I know on a maybe a bigger curveball or something like that, when it's coming at a slower velocity and you see it out of the hand and you see, oh, that's going to be nowhere close to the zone. Oh, well, this is going to be the curveball that's going to come back over the plate. I'm ready for it. I'm turning on it, hitting that ball really, really hard. But the interesting thing that you kind of talked about in the first kind of answer here in describing what a pitch tunnel is how it's affecting a hitter's decision point. How does either really kind of a good tunnel or a bad one affect that decision point? Is a good tunnel pushing it back and then making them compensate in some way? And then is a bad tunnel really allowing someone to be like, oh, I know what the pitch is basically out of the hand?
Yeah, like a lot of it has to do with basically hitter confidence in their decision. That if something is obvious, kind of like a curveball, then the hitter needs maybe less time or less mental energy to commit to determining, okay, what pitch is this? Where does it end up? Because with scouting and modern kind of advanced training techniques, like with these, traject machines, you can start to get muscle memory for seeing pitches out of hand. And so if you can more quickly understand that, you kind of can intuit, okay, here's where this pitch is going, or here's what's going to end up, or based on pre-scout, I know that's his curveball, that's his sweeper, he locates these here, so I can try to swing here. So it clears up some of that decision making process, allowing the hitter to make better decisions. There are still like other aspects of the pitch that will determine kind of how hard or easy it is to hit, location, stuff like we've talked about. But this idea of tunneling and arsenal, it's to just give the hitter a harder time, to make them more uncertain, to make them, maybe they have to fire off their B swing instead of their A swing because they might have to manipulate the barrel a little bit to get contact. And like that's a win for the pitcher. If the hitter is any uncertainty on the hitter's side is a plus for the pitcher.
Yeah, your point is to confuse the hitter at the end of the day when you get into that predictability. That's where the issues line up. But it's really fascinating when you look at tunnels and the decision point and what goes into a swing decision, which I know we've talked about on the hitter side, and it really goes hand in hand with tunneling here, is that you see guys have heaters where in baseball that rolling chart is going to be more valuable than just the stat number on face value. And you look at a guy like James Wood, who went on this tear to end the first half, and he was swinging in the zone, I think more than like 10 to 15% more than his season average going into that. And he was able to just turn it up because he's like, I have confidence in what I'm seeing out of the hand. And I'm able to get that A swing off on pitches in the zone and absolutely crush them. And that's really, it comes and goes. There's going to be a day where you're thrown off and then it really kind of dives off. And that's really the combination where there's stats are great and it's great to have the analytics, but at the end of the day, those analytics aren't going through a guy's head in the however many milliseconds it takes between a pitcher releasing a ball and you making that swing decision. There's only so much that can get you there. And when a guy's on a heater, a guy's on a heater. And we've seen that proven over time that there are, hot streaks are real in baseball. It's not all BABIP luck as we've talked about in the past, or, unluckiness in that regard. But going back onto the pitching side here, delivery repeatability is kind of essential in a good tunnel. You think about it on the youth level, or even maybe in the amateur scouting and minor league scouting level, where, this guy, you hear about this guy has really good mechanics, he's able to repeat it. How important is consistently doing that and getting to maybe consistent release points come into tunneling? And is that something that hitters are actually detecting? Or is it something where even if there's a little bit of variance, especially maybe in a fastball changeup tunnel, that's not making a difference, and a good pitch is a good pitch, or a good pairing is a good pairing in that regard?
Yeah, I think an important thing to note, talking about tunneling, is kind of placing it along the spectrum of like, how does this influence the pitch outcomes or the pitch value? And I would say like things like we've talked about, like location is probably paramount. Like it's the biggest driver of the pitch's value. Stuff is also extremely important. And as we talked about, it's very like predictive, it's consistent, and that's why it's useful. And I would say tunneling is definitely third, like a distinct third between those. If you have good stuff in location, you can generally perform well with your pitches. And tunneling is more of like seasoning or a little bit of a sauce to get you to influence kind of outcomes a little bit more. That if you're average or even slightly below average, tunneling kind of will help you punch up your pitches. And then, it might explain a little bit of like, oh, well, he's got good pitches, but maybe they don't tunnel so well, so they don't perform quite as well as you'd think. So like that's kind of an important caveat for this. But regarding delivery repeatability, Fangraphs published a study in 2015 that was essentially, it does have some impact. It's not always consistent across pitchers and definitely not across games, but generally they found that more consistent release points had better outcomes. So there's a little bit of research on that, even if it's not the most like the strongest signal. But I like, just speaking kind of anecdotally, that I would say that there needs to be more consideration to like the why, because I think there are a lot of different ways that release points can be different. That there's deliberate release point variance, and that's like your Nestor Cortez comes to mind as like a guy who's always trying, like your funkiness, like he's always mixing it up, or even like Rich Hill did this a lot. Then there's also kind of what I would describe as mechanical variability. And so that's what we talked about of like a curveball, like Clayton Kershaw's curveball comes to mind, where it has a distinct pop. He also releases it from a very distinct point compared to where the rest of his arsenal is, because that's what he needs to do to get that shape to end up in the zone. And then kind of the last source of release variability is just kind of randomness. And that one seems like the biggest problem, because that one's not purpose driven. That's more scattershot. That's more like loose. Like it feels like he doesn't have command, that they don't really like the pitcher isn't really controlling where his hand ends up. Because on the first two, whether it's deliberate, that you're like, okay, I'm trying to release here on this pitch and maybe a little lower on this next pitch, or mechanical, like with Kirsch's curveball, of like, okay, I need to release my fastballs and sliders here. I need to release my curveball here. And that those are things that are done with intent, and they actually show like an understanding and a control of the body. But if it is more random, that it's less like kinematic control of that release point, that I would think that's a much bigger problem and would point to guys with performance issues. Unfortunately, pitchers aren't telling us like, oh yeah, I screwed that release point up on these pitches after every start. So it's hard to kind of parse through whether that's something that's done intentionally or not. But it's just something to keep in mind when we're thinking about delivery repeatability.
Yeah, I also wonder how many pitchers really can feel that and give direct feedback as to where they're missing on a release point. You may know when that is occurring and know, oh, well, I didn't get on top of that, or I could feel the release being off. But at the end of the day, that is so minuscule. I was looking at the article that you linked, that I will link in the show description, on the importance of release point consistency, that 2015 article written by Daniel Schwartz, who I will have to shout out is also the name of my dad, which I find just very, very funny. But at the bottom, in terms of non-repeatability, you see just a large variance. You see some big curveball guys. Adam Wainwright pops up at the bottom of the list of not being repeatable, as well as Max Scherzer. And that makes sense. These are guys with big curveball shapes that really dominated their success, and that's where it comes up. But then you also see guys that's the cause of struggle, and it's not really one-to-one of, if you're perfectly repeatable, you're going to have success, and if you're not repeatable, that's destined for failure. I thought it was fun to see R.A. Dickey kind of at the bottom of this list, which makes sense with the knuckleball. And even a guy like Nate Eovaldi in 2014, who was striking out just like 15 or so % of the hitters he was facing, compared to where he is now, where you've seen all of the strides that he's taken and has become a consistent strikeout arm compared to what we've seen in the past. When you're looking at, within a tunnel, there's two ways that you can see it. I think the biggest one that we see maybe most on Pitching Ninja is going to be your fastball up and change up down, where it looks like, or even a curveball down, where the fastball just rides up and up and the other pitch just kind of falls off the cliff. And then you see a little bit less so, I think, is that in and out, just because there's maybe less room and you don't have gravity at your side going side to side. Is there a meaningful difference in terms of tunnels that go vertically versus horizontally? Is there one that's more optimal, that's kind of either more pleasing or more effective?
I think we covered it a little bit, or at least like a similar concept on our movement and approach angle podcast with Alice Chamberlain, that I generally, my rule of thumb personally is vertical, in this case, vertical tunneling differences would lead to whiffs, just like we talked about. Movement vertically, approach angle vertically tends to lead to whiffs more. And then horizontal tunneling leads to better batted ball quality for the pitcher. So worse batted ball outcomes, because you're going kind of either up or down, but importantly away from the barrel of the bat. And so you're getting kind of like either a weak grounder or maybe kind of like pops it up off the handle of the bat kind of thing. That's generally how I like. And similar to that episode of, it depends, different pitches, different counts, different leverages, you want to do different things. And so you want to whiff in a 2-strike count, you want a weak batted ball if the pitcher's behind in the count, 3 balls, what have you. So I think it's context based is important, but I think generally whiffs are the more preferable option. So a vertical tunnel, just because it is like a whiff is a whiff is a whiff, it's always the same thing, versus a weakly hit batted ball can still be a hit. There is a little bit of like a dice roll, a probability outcome there, versus kind of the certainty of bat miss ball.
And I think the miss distance data that we now have really makes that interesting in terms of quantifying that deception, the way tunnels interact with a pitch, especially on the vertical side of, is a pitch, especially a changeup or a splitter, that are notoriously fickle when it comes to pitch modeling. How are they playing when it comes to the miss distance? How are bats really, earning whiffs, or rather missing the ball when it comes to that, and how that's getting plotted, which, as we get more and more data for that, I think is going to be really interesting. In terms of kind of continuing speaking on trying to quantify that data, is there any data out there that does look to define that tunneling aspect? I know that is implicitly included in a lot of stuff models, which are based off a pitcher's primary pitch. But is there anything out there that looks at that tunnel specifically, either looking at pairings or overall kind of pitch optimizations?
Yeah, I would say that most stuff models consider, like differences in velocity, differences in movement. Um, Definitely velocity, movement. I think different people have kind of different opinions, or have done different research to see how important it is to anchor that to a fastball or a primary pitch. So that is like in some ways kind of a proxy for tunneling, but it's not kind of explicitly done in this point of view, and it's usually done in a way that, like, okay, well, how does that relate in addition to how much that pitch moved, how much that velocity is? And like in a stuff model, those features are the like tunneling features are going to be much less important, rather than like the actual, like, how fast did it go, how much did it move, where did you release this pitch from, kind of thing. It's just a little extra context, but it's not like an explicit like tunneling metric. um, Baseball Prospectus did some work on tunneling in 2017. They published kind of how they describe tunneling, how they defined it, how they look at it, and then covered a bunch of different metrics like um, tunnel differential, so how far apart pitches are at the tunnel point or the decision point, how far away they are at the plate, speed changes, releases, ratios between all of these things. So they did a lot of great work on that. And that was Brett Sayre, Harry Pavlidis, Jonathan Judge, and Jeff Long. And so that was 2017. So that's coming up on a decade ago. So great job on them. This research it's a testament to how interesting this topic is, but also how like it's not necessarily it has not been solved publicly, that there's not one like, oh, yep, this is the right way to do it. There are a lot of different like contexts and ways to do it. And we've seen with even Baseball Prospectus themselves, like they've updated in last year in 2025. Steven Sutton Brown introduced their new Arsenal metrics, which also have separate components, but important to that are pitch type probability. So that's kind of you could think of like a traditional tunneling metric of like, okay, how likely is this pitch to be this pitch type versus another one? So like, okay, based on what the hitter has seen, it's going to be a fastball, or it's going to be a slider, or, oh, I don't know, like maybe it's a changeup, maybe it's his four seam. That's kind of one of the big, like, you could think of it almost as like one of the like more tunneling-esque stats from that. Maxwell Resnick on a Medium post, but he's now working with the Red Sox. But in 2024, he published some research that was looking at release angles and approach angles and how they contribute to kind of to tunneling value, and looking at how different mixes fare and adding different pitch types fare. And then Driveline Baseball, so third-party development org that's done a lot of great kind of public work. They developed their Arsenal scores that were made up of two components, Mix Plus and Match Plus. So we'll talk probably a little bit more about Mix Plus in a different episode, but Match Plus is specifically quantifying the uncertainty for a hitter in identifying what a pitch type is. So that's kind of what we're talking about here, specifically with tunneling, of how much is a hitter basically guessing that it's this pitch type compared to another pitch type, compared to a third pitch type, and on down, however many pitches that pitcher has throwing against them.
All of which phenomenal resources. Again, these will be linked in the podcast show description. And all of these people who worked on this, probably people we want to have on the podcast at some point, with just brilliant ideas, brilliant minds to pick. But in terms of trying to quantify it, obviously there's a lot of different methods of doing so. Is tunneling alone something that can make a pitcher sustainable without necessarily the true underlying stuff to back it up, or does it eventually get figured out even if the quality is there?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, it's not the most important thing, and I think it's not even the second most important thing. I think that it helps you kind of optimize a pitch mix. Of it helps, okay, maybe you have a little bit of a dead zone fastball, but if you can kind of develop your mix to tunnel off of that better, then that will kind of help your fastball punch up a little bit more than it otherwise would. Or it maybe if you don't have the velo being able to do that, or if you have good command, because tunneling too, if you think about a trajectory of a pitch, well, something that defines a trajectory of a pitch is where it ends up. So if you're able to, you can actually like define a tunnel by commanding well. That's like the idea of, well, if you throw that fastball 6 inches above the zone and then follow it up with a curveball, those actually tunnel really well together. And so like it's kind of like rope a dope strategy of, oh, the hitter's like, oh, he doesn't have the zone, and then suddenly you're getting this really competitive curveball that's breaks a lot differently, falls into the zone, comes in 10 miles an hour slower than the fastball, and so it'll bamboozle you because it'll look the same as that fastball that was poorly located out of the zone. So a lot of these things kind of play into each other, and so that's why I think tunneling serves to like augment the ability to command a pitch or the ability to throw gas and wicked breaking stuff. But it's not necessarily a way to survive on your own or in and of itself.
And I know Fangraphs and the Fangraphs lab has a really cool tool called paired pitches, which allows you to see how this works within any pitcher's arsenal. So you can pull it up. In my example, just because I know I wrote about this a couple months ago, was Cam Schlittler's Triforce of fastballs. And if you pull up the four seam as the anchor pitch, you'll see that the sinker perfectly goes to the arm side and the cutter goes perfectly to the glove side of the zone, where you're getting 95, 98 miles an hour and you have no idea what direction it's going. And you can see how that is an effective strategy. It's not necessarily the optimal way, but it is definitely a way. And you can see on a curveball what those differences look like. But we're going to take a quick break here. And when we come back, we're going to get into arsenal construction and how we can use it to apply the tunneling that we just talked about. And we're back. So now we're going to get into arsenal construction a little bit, get into some pitch types specifically. Tunneling is really that overarching concept of how it applies generally within that relationship. As we kind of talked about here, it isn't the one and only, and there are a lot of ways to mitigate that and succeed, whether you don't have good tunnels or do have good tunnels and maybe don't have great stuff. But then arsenal construction really is getting into how you apply the skills that you have here. So kind of the first thing, and I know I already asked a question similar to this, but what are the properties that make two pitches really good tunnel partners?
So I tend to personally think of it as two components. So pitches that look the same kind of at or between the release and the decision point. So when it comes out of your hand versus where the hitter has to make a decision, that pitches that look the same across and be like at and between those 2 points, I would say those are positive tunnel metrics. Those relate well to good tunneling. And then the second component of tunneling is how different than the location, the movement, how it approaches at the plate relative to either that release or that decision point. That you want those to be very different, that you want that to kind of like explode in movement at the end of the pitch's trajectory. And that those two things working in tandem, very similar from release to decision point, very different from decision point to the plate. That when those are working together, those are pitches that tunnel well. And like I said before, I just think of it like a palm tree. Of it's just like straight line, straight line, straight line, boom, expands out, all the fronds going in all the different directions. Relevant, wore the shirt for a reason, a visual representation here for you.
He's on brand. Meanwhile, I'm wearing a hat that says the Pittsburgh Pirates will be better next year, despite me not being a Pirates fan at all whatsoever. So for all of the audio only people, a real real shout out into the delirium that we've hit on the podcast despite taking a couple of weeks off. But one of the things that I really think about when it comes to kind of the differences and the properties is that you need, when you get into that late break, is that that is something that comes from seam shifted wake a lot of times. I know we've kind of alluded to this a lot of times, but you hear about this late break, but when you're looking at movement numbers on any of these websites, you don't necessarily see that, oh, this 6 inches of break on a cutter, that's late break on this pitch specifically that makes it play up. I know a lot of stuff models look to quantify that, and that's a big part of it. But I did want to just kind of mention there that there is something that does drive that late movement, and it's not just this real. It is kind of a black box in some regard, but it isn't a total black box into what really drives it in terms of how they play together, kind of in terms of getting something that breaks late, in terms of something that is just purely hard and can leave a hitter on the side. Looking at pairings that are really kind of the gold standard here, I think of the fastball changeup, obviously, and the sinker slider, where you're going really far up and really far down, and then obviously left and right in either direction, depending on who's pitching. What do you think drives the biggest part of that? Is it the velocity? Is it the movement profiles? Or is it something that's maybe release point mirroring?
I think, it's a combination of the above, and that's going to be kind of specific to like what the pair you're talking about is. Of like the fastball changeup example is because those are both breaking to the arm side and are probably going to be located to the arm side, that they tend to tunnel well. And then the fastballs, the ideal place for a fastball is up in the zone, even above the zone a little bit. That's where the whiffs are. And so, because of the natural movement of that pitch, it's going to rise more versus a changeup. You want it to kind of fade away, down and away. Or down and, even more to the arm side. And so, because of where the ideal location places for those are, because of how those pitch types tend to move, they will look very similar for a long time until kind of that movement really starts to hit. They really start to break after that decision point. And then they're very different. And when you fold in kind of a third component of a velo step, of that speed difference is going to be anywhere from 5 to 10 miles an hour, that's kind of another level of uncertainty that's being contributed attributed to that. And then sinker slider is another one that is just like, yeah, sinkers arm side, sliders located away. Generally sliders are a little bit down, sinkers are a little bit up. And that's just kind of, if you think about it, like you try and throw them, like if you aim middle, the sinker is going to break up to your arm side, the slider is going to break down to your glove side. And so if you're kind of releasing them at that same point, that's probably going to be how the start of their ball flight goes. Is it's going to go toward, they're both going to appear to go towards the middle, and then at the end they're going to break in like complete opposite directions. And so that's another kind of example of a good pitch, that a good pitch pairing, because of how you want to release them to end up in the locations that you want them to, and then also how they break to get to those locations.
Yeah, I know there's the general concept that you want everything to look the same. However, when you get into the velocity aspect of that and you're kind of minimizing overall break profiles across an entire arsenal, you can run yourself into trouble where everything is going to be hard. A hitter's geared up for hard, and they're ready to go. I think of like a Taj Bradley, for example, when he first came up, where every single pitch he had was hard. It was in the 90s. He had the kind of one-off splitter, and then he's really focused on actually being able to command a curveball that gives him that additional change in pace that allows, even if it doesn't tunnel as you want, it shows you how it works and how it makes the entire arsenal come together when, he's got something that you can't completely ignore. You can't be gearing up for a quick decision every time. You have to worry that, he might wipe me out with a curveball below the knees when I was expecting something coming in at good velocity. But staying on that, there are a lot of pitches like that, like a Taj Bradley. I mean, I know we've mentioned Kirsch's curveball already. That obviously has such a big movement profile that there's nothing that goes along with it. What really is the importance of having that profile that doesn't necessarily match to everything else?
I think these are things where kind of a stuff model will kind of help explain this of they tend to be kind of bigger, either loopier, sweepier pitches. And so you can get if you can get like a lot of movement and a decent amount of speed on those can be pretty nasty. I think too a lot of it is change of pace, just because to get those shapes, you have to manipulate the ball more, and generally manipulating the ball means you're going to have to take some amount of speed off of it rather than just a pure fastball release. And so there's going to be that velo gap, and they serve, and so that'll like serve as like a change of pace to like now, okay, I have to anchor myself to a fastball velocity, but now I have to be able to dial it all the way back to maybe a curveball that could be like 15 miles an hour slower. And then if you have something like a changeup, a slider, a cutter, then that's like a third or even a fourth velo band in the middle of it. And so that kind of helps flesh out an arsenal from like a velo dimension. And it's also just the idea of pitchability and sequencing. That if hitters know that you have more pitches to deal with, it's a little bit harder to sit and wait for something that there's a reason that Nick calls flipping in a curveball for a called strike free real estate. That hitters generally aren't going to sit a curveball on the first pitch. And so they're probably going to sit fastball. And so if they see this shape that doesn't match what their expectation is, they're likely to not swing at it. And so you can kind of sneak in that curveball, even though it's maybe it doesn't tunnel as well, it's less obvious, just because the hitter might be more geared up for something else, that even if it's immediately identifiable, the hitter now kind of, it's not the decision making on its own, that it's like they need to change what their like intent was as a result of that decision. And like that adds kind of complexity, that adds reaction time to it.
Yeah, you think about that free real estate, I think my mind immediately goes to OO counts.
Hmm.
OO counts this year get on fastballs thrown in OO counts, 34% of them get swings. Curveballs get about 23%. So it's about a 10% difference because everyone's like, oh, I'm going to get that fastball. It's going to be a very easy pitch to hit. And sure enough, they're going to take their A swing on it because they know what they're getting. The second you see any movement, it's like, oh, well, I don't want to waste my bat on this pitch that's moving that I don't know what to do with. So it really gives you
Hmm.
that ability to build out the arsenal. And then once you get ahead, especially with the slow curveball, that's not usually what the arsenal is built on. And then you've got a whole plethora of weapons to work with there of, oh, well, now I'm ahead 0-1 and he's only seen a curveball. I could set him up with another fastball and then get into something breaking down deep in the dirt, even go back to another curveball, or then start to get horizontal with maybe a slider or something on the inside. When it comes to tunneling, I think generally what we've talked about here is things off of fastballs or why things don't tunnel off of fastballs. So is it a fastball and something else vertical, or maybe a sinker or a cutter and then something else moving the other way? But when you get to two pitches with the same movement profile but very different velocities, is that something that does tunnel generally, or is that something that is not tunneling and just work differently in a hitter's mind?
Yeah, I'd say like they do tunnel in a sense that like I tend to think primarily tunneling is like shape driven, like moving vertically or horizontally, but velocity, so like you could think of that as like distance to or from home plate is also a level for tunneling. We talked about that a little bit. I would, you know, I personally think that the velo difference might be kind of the lesser aspect of tunneling. In the Maddox quotes that I mentioned before, he basically talks about like, oh, hitters can't judge velo. He's like, look at that car, you don't know if it's going 55, 65, or 75 when it's driving at you. And like I get kind of the idea behind that. Whether that's backed up by data is another different story, but I think that velo tunnel is maybe less impactful than the shape tunnel. I will say that it builds a foundation though for the rest of a mix. So I wouldn't want that to be my like my main two options only are velo differentiated. But if I have a third option that you could kind of really flesh out a mix with that. So like the idea that comes to my head is like a four seam sinker changeup. That those are all pitches that are moving arm side, but if you have a changeup and sinker that have the same shapes but velo's different, now you have a lot more uncertainty that the hitter can't just sit speed because four seam and sinker have different movement profiles. They also can't just sit shape because the sinker and changeup have a different profile than the four seam, and the changeup, it like, and so now you have increasing levels of uncertainty, and additional pitches kind of folded in on top of that compound the tunneling benefit. Because if you have two similar pitches that are only separate by velo, well, if you can add a pitch type that tunnels well with one of them, it's going to kind of implicitly tunnel well with the other one. And so like that there's like duplicative effects for that tunneling if you can like fold in more pitch types to it. So I think I would not want to base my repertoire around that, but I think that it is like a positive. You could think of it almost as like a bridge pitch for an arsenal.
Yeah, the one pitcher that stands out, he's maybe my favorite to watch in baseball, does this essentially. I don't know if you can think of who I'm thinking of here. One of the best in baseball, but does his best work when it comes to these two pitches, similar movement profiles at a different velocity. I'll give you a minute here. Sorry for the pop quiz here, but this is what we expect from the
Well, I
dating.
mean, it comes to me like Schlittler's a guy. Like you think of like the fastball triad of four seam sinker cutter. Like that seems like a guy who has a mix that has three things that seem like they tunnel. They would all be they're just different enough that the tunnels augment each other.
So it's going to be Chris Sanchez in the sinker
Love him so much.
sinker changeup, right? They move the same way. The changeup obviously has a lot more drop to it than the sinker does, but there is just the substantial way that he is able to tunnel them off each other, change speeds, and then I really like that you have with a deeper arsenal, you're able to then go the other way. When you're so worried about the sinker or the changeup, he can throw that slider that's moving a completely different direction. I think another guy, I'm just maybe sticking with left-handed pitchers here because that is who I really love. But Reed Detmers, of you have the fastball and sinker kind of pair, and then you have the changeup, and there's a lot of things that even though the changeup isn't great, it's something to think about, and then it allows that slider to dominate where he's able to oversaturate that in the zone because you have options that move the other way. I think when it comes to bridge pitches, I know the primary example that everyone thinks of is the cutter between the fastball and the slider, right? Where you have the fastball up top, you have the cutter that's a mix of the two, both in velocity and movement, and then you have the slider. But I think the bridge pitch, generally speaking, when it comes to Arsenal, I think really comes when you look at these really, really wide Arsenal guys. Obviously, a
Mhm.
Seth Lugo is going to be a really good example of that. I think a Logan Gilbert might be a really good example of that, where you have just a ton of pitches where even though they're, some of them are going to stand out on their own, more so with Gilbert than with a Lugo. You have a lot of shapes that are moving in similar directions at slightly different velocities where you can't just settle in on one shape. You have to worry that it is going to move. It is going to create uncertainty in ways that you may not expect otherwise.
Yeah, one of my favorite kind of like down ballot, like it's hard to call a four seamer a bridge pitch, but it's Logan Webb's four seam fastball, and because he's sinker, changeup, sweeper, like those are his big three, those are his bread and butter pitches. But then you look at like last year, his four seam fastball had an 18.5 swinging strike rate, like it had a 34% whiff rate, which is just obscene for a pitch that was coming in at under 93 miles an hour. And I think a lot of it had to do with it just tunneled really well with his stuff. And it tunneled well with his sweeper, it tunneled well with his changeup, it tunneled well with his cutter. Um, so it really like worked with his other pitches, and it served as a way to like kind of augment his mix. It was a way for him to like add another pitch that like on its own like is bad to like horrible. Like it has some of the worst stuff values, but because it tunneled well and served as like another offering, another look, that it had just these really outsized impact on results.
Yeah, looking at Webb's four seam fastball, even this year, it's performing really well. It's keeping a similar to last year, like 35, 36-ish% zone rate. It has just kind of a hilarious 18% CSW. Obviously, it hasn't had as many whiffs this year as last year, but it still is a sub 200 average on it and not a lot of hard contact. And that shows that if you're doing things the right way and you have this pitch that has a specific utility in the arsenal, you're able to execute it and get the results. But since we've kind of naturally transitioned into players, we're going to take one more break here and then get into some fun pairs and arsenals across the league. And we're back. So we're going to finish up here talking about two different players each with some fun pairs within their arsenals and how it all kind of comes together here, bringing everything we've talked about into some 2026 examples. So Kyle, I'll kick it to you first. Is there any kind of first fun pair that stands out the most to you?
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to like kind of give some consideration to is guys who seem like they're outperforming their underlying pitch quality. And a guy that kind of jumped to mind immediately was Davis Martin, who's throwing a 3.4 ERA across 100 innings. He also has a great FIP of 3.1 right now. But you look at his pitch grades, like PLV isn't a huge fan, Stuff Plus, Pitching Bot, all of them are like very underwhelmed. But the reason is not only does he tunnel well, but he also does it well against the different platoons. So versus righties, he's throwing his slider 30% of the time, and that's a pitch that really tunnels extremely well with his fastballs, so his sinker and his four seam and his cutter. And so it gives him this like very useful four pitch mix that he can attack righties with. And then versus lefties, it's a similar thing of he leans much more on his four seam and curveball, and those also still tunnel well with his cutter. And so he can kind of flex different aspects of his repertoire to different handednesses and can kind of highlight that, okay, well, these tunnel well because of how they move and how I locate them versus righties, and then change that dynamic a little bit versus lefties and like maintain good tunneling even when he's dynamically changing his pitch mix and where he locates them. So yeah, Davis Martin was one that kind of has stood out by how well I like how his mix versus righties and versus lefties tunnels.
Yeah, he's really interesting because he has had quite the like much of the White Sox really just a big step forward this year. I know it's kind of fallen off a little bit, but to see the success and a lot more whiffs this year has been really fun in an arm that kind of on the surface is maybe not as interesting as he really turns out to be. My first choice here is going to be Brian Wu. I know there's been a lot of talk about him this year, really struggling away from home. What was really interesting to me on the surface was that he's actually giving up less homers per nine than any of his previous seasons. And I think it's kind of a microcosm of, trust the peripherals that the ERA estimators and a good whip and a good K minus BB are all going to come together. But he has a really strong combination between the fastball, the sinker, and the changeup with a lot of very similar release traits that allow them all to play up. Even though his pure IVB on the fastball and sinker don't look particularly impressive, it's a big thing when it comes to approach angles. As the name of the podcast suggests, that he's able to perform really, really well at the top of the zone with the fastball and even with the sinker, where they play really, really up, and that it gives him a lot of opportunities against righties to go away with the sweeper and the slider, as well as the changeup, which has been a little bit more inconsistent against lefties. But it gives him a really interesting mix where you can see him executing, and the locations are consistently good enough that the movement profiles are working kind of as intended, that there's enough overlap that I think he's going to figure it out, and it's a really fun mix that is a heavy dose of fastballs, and it's really fun to see a guy with outlier release traits kind of pummel the zone with all of these offerings and obviously struggle, but we're going to see how he works through it.
Yeah, and then another guy, specifically this one is a particular pairing, but it's Nolan McLean. And we talked before about how massive breaks, huge shapes might actually be like harmful to tunneling, and that tracks. You mentioned the pair plots from Fangraphs, and if you use Nolan McLean, the spread on his pitches is just massive. It takes up like the whole screen. I think there's something like a 50-inch difference between his four seam and his curveball, which you'll note is much larger than the distance of the strike zone. But I wanted to talk specifically about his just wipeout breaking pitches. So his sweeper and his curveball, that they're, massive, massive shapes. We talked about it before. It's kind of easy to rule them out of hand of like, okay, these are definitely not McLean's fastballs coming in. But I just like that they share a lot of release traits, that he basically lets them go at a similar angle, and he lets their just massive distances in movement play up by releasing them there and then locating them kind of basically as the movement guides them. And so even though they're these just huge shapes, they're coming in 10 plus miles an hour slower than his fastballs, like this pair within his arsenal actually works really well. That they help each other play up even more than their kind of like implicit wipeout stuff even would say.
Yeah, I mean, he's as fun to watch pitch as possible, and I really like the concept of breaking pitches being tunnels for one another, because once you've recognized as a hitter that it is a breaking pitch, it's a lot easier to freeze on that when you don't know which way it's turning. And
Yeah, like if his sweeper, like if there's still a 12-inch difference in movement between where his sweeper moves and where his curveball moves. And so even if you're like, okay, these are the big looping breakers, like you still got a foot of uncertainty in guessing which is which.
And it gives you the vertical difference that misses the bat every single time.
Yeah.
The last one we're going to close with here is going to be maybe the most popular of the group, and that's going to be Paul Skenes. Obviously, he is struggling. It's been unbelievably horrible. It's a 3.5 ERA and a 1 WHIP. Calm down, people. I know there
well,
are
like the hat says, he'll be better next year.
Yeah, he'll be better next year. He's saving himself for the playoffs or next year. Or I might get yelled at if I say another team. But there are some legitimate things about Skenes that have taken away from what we should expect from him this year, whether it's the velocity or kind of, I wrote about him a couple of weeks ago and how he's really transitioned into being a vertical pitcher, which I think has led to more homers, even while he's pitching well. But looking at Paul Skenes' four-seamer, it pairs well with just about every pitch in his arsenal. It gets a lot of run for being a four-seam fastball, but then you've got a sinker that really plays well off of it, getting even more arm side. You've got the splinker and the changeup as two distinct shapes below a four-seam, so you can get that vertical separation. And then that sets you up nicely because it has a lot of horizontal break into the slider, the sweeper, the curveball. So it's really fascinating to see that for such a deep mix, the fastball is such an absolute anchor pitch. And obviously the velocity is a really core part to why he's struggling, is why the rest of the arsenal plays off of it. But you can see that that alone is an elite characteristic that he is going to need to be able to harness in order to succeed, even if he's going to be throwing at a lower velocity. I think it's also interesting to see for Skenes specifically that, well, he has been quote unquote struggling. All of the peripherals are just still bonkers across the entire arsenal. Like there is that surface level struggle, but there isn't a nit to pick in any of this. There is, good whiff rates, good performances on a lot of his secondary pitches. And while it isn't, there are ups and downs for a great pitcher like him. There's enough tools there that if you told him he had to pitch game one of a playoff series tomorrow, he would be able to harness the arsenal in a way that executes at a lights out level. I have no question about that. And I think he's trying to harness everything while the regular season is still going on. But that'll really do it for this episode of The Approach Angle. Really got into a lot of tunneling and Arsenal things. I think this was a really fun discussion, and we've kept it under an hour by all accounts, which is impressive. So Kyle, anything you're working on that you want to share with the crowd?
Yeah, so we just released our alpha version of the Pitcher List Pro dashboard. So I know we've talked about it in other podcasts, but I'm super excited. It's you can incorporate your specific fantasy league. It'll pull up your team and it'll serve you all of our Pitcher List stats, Process Plus, PLV, all of that good stuff, so you can see how your hitters rate, how potential free agent pickups rate. It'll give you all of our charts. It gives you the rankings, so like you can see like, okay, here's what Jordan Walker's Process Plus is, and here's where Scott ranks him on the hitter list this week. So it's a great like repository of all of the really, really awesome work that the site and all of the tremendous staff put together, and now it's kind of all in one place and specifically optimized to help you and your fantasy team succeed.
Yeah, it's really awesome to see it finally out, and to be able to test it and play around with it is really, really exciting. Selfishly, for my fantasy teams, which are in a far better position at this time in the season than they normally are, which I won't complain. And yeah, you can find me, writing. It's been a couple weeks off. It has been the summer break. Again, I'd like to reiterate, very much not an all-star break for me, but I mean, maybe for Kyle with all of the PL Pro dashboard stuff and other stuff that he's working on, but really getting back into some of the writing stuff. I'm working on an article on Troy Melton coming out next week, which I'm really excited about where that's going. And then that'll kick off the second half of the season. But that'll do it for this episode of the Approach Angle podcast, and we will see you on the next one.